Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm really very glad to be joined today by one of our authors and my friend, Wes Howard-Brook, who has been working with Orbis for decades now. And this is an opportunity to talk about two of his, I think, most significant works he's done for us and his most recent. First about Wes. He and his wife, Sue Ferguson Johnson, share in the ministry Abide in Me, which seeks to interweave the mystical and prophetic elements of discipleship. Wes has been teaching at the intersection of church, academy, and the public since 1988, and is the author, co-author, or editor of 7 Orbis books. His current project is Radical Bible, a YouTube channel where he is building a library of detailed commentaries on the Bible in video format. So you can look for that and you'll learn a lot. We're going to be talking about these 2 books today. The first of them is called Come Out My People, God's Call Out of Empire in the Bible and Beyond. You can see this is a big book. And there's another big book here, sequel, Empire Baptized, How the Church Embraced What Jesus Rejected, 2nd to 5th centuries. In simple terms, Come Out My People is a comprehensive interpretation of the Bible, which sees it as reflecting a struggle between competing religious visions, what he calls the religion of empire and a religion of creation embraced by the prophets and by Jesus. So in other words, the 2 religions is not a tension between the Old Testament religion and the New Testament religion of Jesus. Instead, these 2 religious visions, creation and empire, exist in a very uneasy tension throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus, in this perspective, is the inheritor, not the initiator of that prophetic creation-centered religion. If I got that pretty much right, Wes.
Sounds good. Sounds interesting to me.
Tell us what that means, the religion of creation, the religion of empire, how that's
Yeah.
reflected in the Bible.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. And as your introduction indicated, and I just want anybody who's listening to note, our relationship now goes back to 1992 when I first left you a voicemail as a cold stranger. I wasn't cold, but the voicemail was cold around a gigantic manuscript I'd written on the Gospel of John, and you were good enough to call me back. So here we are 33 years later, and I'm grateful for all the steps along the way. Reason that I was asking you, actually, for anybody watching, I asked you if we could do this today, even though the second of the 2 books you introduced is almost 9 years old now, because it seems like the moment we're in calls for the kind of clarity that I hope the paradigm in the 2 books represents. Because Christians, quote unquote, are clearly a major constituency of Trump's support. And yet anybody who's an Orbis reader or a watcher of these videos recognizes the kind of Christianity that they espouse and embody has little to do with the gospel of Jesus or any of the tradition of liberation theology that Orbis so wonderfully pioneered more than half a century ago now. So what do we do with that? Do we just see them as aberrant? And well, I'll start with the conclusion, then we can work our way back to say, actually, no. They are not aberrant. They are more inclined toward what Christianity was at the origins than those of us who would envision a different version of the church. And let me say that in addition to the fact that I think those of us who have used the words like progressive to describe an alternative view of what the United States might be politically and culturally are imagining that we were moving kind of steadily toward what we were supposed to be as a nation. But I'd like to say the analogy between what the United States is and what the church is, and our misunderstandings of their origin and their purpose are parallel, which is to say that the United States was plainly created to be a white supremacist patriarchy. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's what it was created to be. That was the vision all along. And the idea that it could be something else, Martin Luther King's or William Garrison's vision 100 years earlier, or so many other people who envisioned a multicultural, inclusive, egalitarian society, were proposing a model that the United States had never embraced. And in a similar way, to see a Christianity that is gathered around the poor and is egalitarian and opposes war and in John Deere's lifetime quest embodies nonviolence, goes completely against what the church was founded to be. So that's the bottom line. So how do we get there, and how do my books help to clarify that? Is I think part of your question there. So the the great misunderstanding, as you alluded to in the introduction, Robert, is that somehow it's the God of the Old Testament that's the problem, the warmongering, hateful God of the Old Testament, and Jesus comes along and reveals this new God of love. But that's nonsense. The only God Jesus knows, whether traditionally in the sense of through the scripture or through his own personal experience, is the Creator, is Yahweh. Is the God of creation. There's no hint anywhere in the Gospels that Jesus is offering a different name for God or a different God than that of his ancestors, the Israelites and Judites. What he's arguing with is the interpretation made by the elite, especially the scribes and the priests, who want to legitimize Rome's rule as somehow God's doing. And of course, the benefit to them is they get to be the puppet servants of Rome, as empires always do with local religious leaders. A few hundred years later, Alexander the Great took the priests of Ra in Egypt, and in the city that he had named for himself, of course, Alexandria, declared himself a pharaoh, and got religious legitimation among ordinary Egyptians. So that pattern is consistent throughout. So what we see in the Hebrew scripture is not that different than what we see nowadays in the wide circle of what we might call the church or Christianity, which is to say an argument between a range of views. In the book, and as you noted, there's a spectrum between these two poles of religion of empire, religion of creation. But there are many texts that are somewhere in the middle, just like today we would have people who are against war, but don't necessarily oppose the church being involved with the government, and et cetera. So various places on the spectrum for that. And one of the beautiful things I think about the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition that Christianity has often struggled to accept is the embrace of ambiguity, the embrace of multiple viewpoints. And not having to reduce it to there's a right answer, and anybody who doesn't agree with that right answer is a heretic and needs to be expelled or burned at the stake, or I guess not worse than burned at the stake. So the compilers put in competing views. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. They put in the very pro David views that we see in, for example, in 2 Samuel 7. You see the very anti-Canaanite and anti-immigrant views that you see in Deuteronomy 7. You must destroy all the peoples of the land. But you also see Leviticus 19. You must love the immigrant as yourself. And so anybody who's under the illusion that the Bible speaks in one voice and you can put it all together into a single unified viewpoint has obviously never read it. But that makes perfect sense. Why would we expect that they would all agree on the big questions, especially in the absence of a religious hierarchy that's purpose is to enforce a party status quo, as Catholicism obviously developed over time. Once the temple was destroyed in 70 by the Romans, there's never been a Jewish hierarchy for over 2,000 years. I mean, to be a Jew is to say it's whatever I want it to be, really. And there's no one who can say otherwise. That's true at some level for a Christian too, but not if you want to belong to an institution that says, well, you've got to believe these things or you've got to act in certain ways. So I've lost my screen for a second. I'll come back. There we go. So Jesus comes into that, and as I think we see plainly in the New Testament, he's not trying to start a new religion. He's not opposing the text of the past. If anything, he's saying it's his followers who don't understand the scriptures, like you see in the road to Emmaus in Luke. How foolish you are, how slow to understand your own stories. And the point there, I would say, is they were expecting, as they say, we had been hoping that he would be the one to liberate Israel, which is to say, the Messiah on the white horse, so to speak, although David never rode a white horse, or a horse at all. But instead, they got the suffering servant from Isaiah. And note, from Isaiah, that story was there all along as an alternative way in which empire would be opposed, by just taking it on and not responding in kind. And his opponents are the members of his own tradition who side with the religion of empire and support that. So I think that becomes pretty clear in terms of the biblical half of the project. I don't know if you want to add anything or ask anything about that before I move on to the church part of it.
Well, I wonder if you could clarify a little bit more, since that's, saying Jesus is the inheritor of that tradition. What is the religion of creation?
So the religion of creation is basically the gospel in the sense that he's bringing forward from texts like Genesis and Exodus and the prophets and others um, a way of being in the world that's completely contrary to empire. For instance, first chapter of Genesis says all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So if that's so, and all are, and God sees it as very good, there's immediately no basis for saying we're superior to you, whoever we is and whoever you are. From God's perspective, all human beings without distinction are made in the image and likeness of God. Um, and further, that Genesis shows that cities, agglomerations of power and wealth, are the threat to the earth and to human beings. The cause of the flood is the violence that humans have made on the earth. And so we see that throughout Genesis of a people struggling to live outside of empire. I don't need to say how Exodus is an anti-empire text, do I? It obviously is calling people out of Egypt. Um, and we see in the prophets, for example, that Ezekiel's a classic example. The reason that people are wandering around astray is the shepherds are getting fat on the sheep and collaborating with empire, in that case, the Babylonians. So the religion of creation, in the positive sense, is the recognition that all of creation is one, and it's all good in God's eyes. And so we should treat one another and all our non-human siblings with love and dignity and respect and honor, etc. At one level, it's obvious. I mean, like, what could be more obvious? But the reason it's not obvious is the religion of empire is powerful and always has controlled the media since the invention of media, right? Writing is a function of empire. So empire has always controlled the public narrative. The Hebrew scripture, in part, is an attempt to offer a counter narrative for the people who could listen, not the Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman narratives, which are all basically the same, hence the religion of empire, in contrast with the opposite. Yeah, and you see that so clearly, for example, in Acts. In Luke's second volume, where the first thing they do is share everything in common, and they're doing it joyfully, and they're not afraid. Peter was terrified of being seen as, "You're one of them, aren't you?" No, 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 not. It's just 2 months later, right? Pentecost, just 2 months later, he's suddenly, "People of Jerusalem, listen to me. We're going to arrest you and put you in jail. Yeah, okay, go ahead. And I'll come out and I'll come right back here again." Suddenly he's fearless. That's the empowerment of that Jesus offers as a part of the religion of creation. And that's nothing new. We hear it in the prophets. We heard from Joel here in this season of Lent. We just had Ash Wednesday, right? Your children shall see vision, your old people have dreamed dreams, etc. And the Spirit will be poured out. So that's been the tension from the very beginning. And I would say literally from the beginning of writing. That one of my arguments in the book is that and Come Out My People, is the first biblical text, maybe not the first little piece. Scholars can argue about whether they're little scraps of little pieces. But the first continuous narrative is the David-Solomon legitimation of why should Solomon be king. And we don't need to talk about that right now, but it's not at all obvious that he should be king. In fact, his brothers don't necessarily think he should be king. And some of David's officials don't think he should be king, but he ends up being king. And so that has to have a justification. And the narrative is written to do that. And then Exodus is written to justify the rebellion against his successor. So that the three pharaohs in Exodus represent sequentially David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. The three kings who imprisoned Israelites within a Judahite monarchy. And they had to write a story that legitimized why it's okay, why in fact God wants you to rebel against a king who claims to have divine authority and to establish a separate reality apart from that.
Even in the composition of the Bible, I take it that that hand of empire determined the recounting or the memory of the history of Israel, so that you have the liberating story of the Exodus, and then the story of the conquest of Canaan, and which evidently is not an historical fact, but in depicting Israel's origins as kind of in the model of the Egyptians or other empires.
Yeah, well, as you know, and as you know from Dorothy Day's work over time and Martin Luther King and other people that you've studied it in depth, the struggle continues. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
like you're going to win the battle for hearts and minds, and now we've achieved victory. There's always going to be the ongoing struggle. I mean, just this week, right? Facebook is facing Meta, whatever, that one of its former executives is going to blow the whistle on them, and now they're preparing already the counter narrative to that book. I mean, that's just how it goes. You can't stop there from being, the continual attempting to retell the story in a different way. One of the things about the Bible, and really one of the things that historians, secular historians, if you will, would agree on, is that, history is a narrative, right? It's not what happened. It's
Mhm.
a current, whoever wrote its version of sifting through and choosing and putting it in a certain kind of prose and framing it a certain way, which is not the same as events. Even when we just tell our life story, like you and I have known each other for 30 years, I've spent time in your home, etc. And yet all I know of you is what you've told me. We haven't actually experienced that much life day to day. So we don't live together. We're not literal siblings. We haven't grown up together. So it's your version of your past that I know, and the same with what you know about me. I tell my story, and that's what you know about me. We're not researching our friends to find out if that's really true. We rely on that. But I know that a lot of the story I tell you, it's not a lie. I'm trying to be honest with you. But am I remembering it accurately? I don't know. Who knows? Memory is fallible. So the
Mhm.
combination of memory, ideology, unconscious bias, all those things affect the biblical authors like they affect everybody.
Mhm. Mhm.
We can't separate that out. But I think those who were trying to write an alternative story were at least acting on the belief that the creator who called them into being a people
Mhm.
wanted them to live in a way that honored the diversity of life and not create a uniformity of life, whether that's in
Mhm.
the kind of people or the way you think.
Mhm.
I want to make sure we have a few minutes. I know time is limited to talk about what that means for the church.
Please
If
do.
I
Yeah, your
can segue to
second
that.
book, Empire Baptized.
Yeah. So that was a very hard book to write. And when my wife Sue, who you mentioned, my ministry partner, was listening to me reading some of this, she said, "How can you read some of this stuff? It's so horribly misogynist and anti-creation." And I said, "And you're only getting the highlights, or lowlights, as the case may be." The reality is that Jesus did not intend to start a new religion. There's no hint of that anywhere in the New Testament at all. He's claiming a part of the tradition, and he's willing to die for it. Um, Luke, who's the only one of the gospel writers who mentions the word Christianity, says it's something other people called them, much like members of the Church of Latter-day Saints were called Mormons. But it wasn't their idea to call themselves Mormons, but they kind of accept it after a while. You can call them Mormons and they're not offended. Um, but Christianity was an invention of platonically trained elites in the Roman Empire who would certainly have seen the literal message of Jesus as a terrible threat to the status quo, as it was, and would not at all be comfortable with publicly being associated with that for a whole slew of reasons I don't have time to get into here, but I describe in more detail in the book. And so they did two major steps. They said the way to interpret the Bible is allegorically because the creator God isn't concerned with trivial things like wars and people getting food and little things like that. The creator God's only concerned with one thing, your soul. A concept that the Bible has no knowledge of at all because it's a Greek concept. It's not a biblical concept. The biblical concept of a human being from Genesis is we're earth stuff with God's spirit in it, right?
Mhm.
Yahweh breathed the breath of life and it became a nephesh, a living being. But there's no separate thing called a soul. That's a Greek notion because the Greek philosophers were very disturbed by change
Mhm.
um, and found change difficult to grapple with. And so they thought the only thing that's really good is something that's permanent. And since your body isn't permanent and society isn't permanent, those things can't have ultimate value. The only thing of ultimate value is something that's permanent, and that's your soul. So that's the only thing that matters. So the
Mhm.
way to read the Bible is that it's all about the soul.
Mhm.
It's not about worldly issues of economics and justice and all those things. And that's why, as you well know, Orbis was a major factor. People like James Cone rediscovering, wait a minute, the Bible is about justice. We were told a lie about that. All as recently as the 1960s when he, began his incredible work. So that paradigm among the so-called church fathers, that it's to read it allegorically and that the soul is all that matters, um, led us away from ever really hearing what the New Testament was about. And so Christians who hear the gospel, who read Orbis books or other things like that, and go, wait a minute, want the church to conform to the gospel, but it wasn't created to conform to the gospel. It was created to conform to Roman norms. Hence, basilicas, for example, which were secular buildings that Romans had. All the elements of the Roman Catholic liturgy, as I'm sure other of your writers can express more detail than me, are taken directly from Roman imperial liturgies. And the names, even the names of the roles and diocese and, vicar and all those things are all Roman imperial titles and roles. Nothing to do with the gospel. Um, so my sense in this Trump moment is that people who identify, whether you call yourself a Christian or a Catholic or a Protestant, whatever, if you believe that the gospel of Jesus is the way that will lead to peace and justice for all of creation, then it's time to do that in contexts that are faithful to the vision of Jesus, which is egalitarian circles, where there's not hierarchy, where everyone's welcome, where nobody's getting paid, perhaps. I said that in a college class one time, and a student was shocked when he said, if we lived in the gift economy, how would church staff get paid? And I said, who said there should be church staff? Like, whoever said that preaching the gospel was a way to make a living and get benefits and all that? I don't resent people who do. You got to make a living in one way or another. But that's not the purpose of the church, to provide jobs for its employees. It's to proclaim the gospel, and if you get gifted for that, then that's fine. And that's not a fantasy. It is possible, at least in part, gradually to live that way. And I think, people like Chet Myers and others have been writing on that about economics, the gift economy, and Sabbath economics for decades now, and again have expressed that in more depth than I have.
Well, on the one hand, you talk about that turn toward the movement of emphasis on the salvation of the soul, individual soul, as opposed to the kind of social uh, transformation of relationships that Jesus was preaching. But another aspect of that you go into is how the shift then goes from Jesus's emphasis on how you live to how you believe, what you believe.
Yeah.
And so the emphasis on doctrine,
Yep.
and that means an emphasis on orthodoxy and battles between what is the correct doctrine,
Yep.
the persecution or expulsion of people who deviate from the correct view, and that becomes a huge theme for thousands of years.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Robert, because that's not a Jewish Christian distinction. That's a Jewish Greek distinction in
Mhm.
terms of language and reality. And as you well know, you can get off in all kinds of postmodern theories. I want to go down that road. But the basic nature of Hebrew as a language with no vowels and no capitalization and no space between words and no punctuation is ambiguity. And the joy of ambiguity, the
Mhm.
pleasure of ambiguity,
Mhm.
the wonders of having words have multiple meanings that you can look at from different angles, like a wonderful piece of art, right? That you can look at from one angle and then you go, but wait a minute, I can also look from this. And they're both true, if true is even the right quality there. Whereas the Greek mind, wrongly, as modern linguists and philosophers have noted, believe that it could be a one-to-one correspondence between language and reality. So as you well know, the endless fight over homoousios,
Mhm.
the word that, makes no iota of difference because homoousios or homoousios is one iota different, right? This
Mhm.
trying to define this relationship between Jesus' humanity as divinity. But the Bible's never, ever concerned with that kind of thing, with defining. How many titles are there for Jesus? In John's gospel, there's 8 titles for Jesus in the first chapter. And there's no definitive answer. They're all true, sort of, partly.
Mhm.
They're all iconic. They point to something.
Mhm.
But there's no point in arguing which one is right,
Mhm.
because it's not about right and wrong. Language simply doesn't actually work that way. And
Mhm.
the ancient Israelite authors didn't have a modern theory of language to justify it, but for whatever reason, they knew that ambiguity was more lifelike than false certainty. And that's why they could put multiple viewpoints in the book as well as write stories. When I'm doing my videos for Radical Bible and the David story, in the same chapters, there's pro and anti-David scenes.
Mhm.
There's scenes you can say this is David's greatest moment, but if you twist it from a slightly different angle, it's ironic, and you can see his lowest moment.
Mhm.
And it's just the beauty of that. And uh, there's not a direct continuity between those ancient authors and modern, but look how many Jewish comedians are really good at that kind of thing. Whether it's Letty Bruce, a classic like that, but how many Mort Saul, how many Jewish comedians have been able to use humor to skewer the people in power and their own, hypocrisies, by using that kind of irony and satire. And the Bible is filled with that kind of stuff. The Platonists didn't have much of a sense of humor. The church fathers just were not funny. They were not lighthearted. They were extremely serious and thought they were right. So you get a Clement of Alexandria who goes on for pages against sauces, against the evil of eating sauces and baked goods as trivial, as not as beneath the dignity of a Christian. Really, Clement? You're not going to let people have some nice barbecue sauce or whatever your pesto or whatever it is, enjoy life. They did not enjoy life. They wanted to be over so they could go somewhere else, you
Mhm.
know? And that's the kind of joylessness that was around so much of Christianity, right? This veil of tears, you just kind of get through it and maybe it'll be better in the afterlife. But Jesus was all about now. I've come that their joy may be in them, he says, your joy, God's joy, and their joy may be fulfilled and complete.
Let me ask you a question. We're a little short on
Sure.
time. You started off by saying, well, the church was never meant to reflect the teachings of Jesus, you might say, and yet there have been to say that interpretation or that tradition is lost wouldn't be correct either. You see
Of
people
course.
throughout history who, including Saint Francis, including Dorothy Day or
And
Anabaptists.
look what happened to Francis.
Yes, no, well, it's true. That they do try to adapt him exactly to the system hasn't happened to Dorothy Day yet. It could still.
Sort
Uh,
of.
we've got to have Martin Luther King Day, a national holiday celebrated by Coca
Sure.
and
Exactly. You
everybody.
got it. Answering your own
But
question.
but but there is that constant counter voice, and it seems to be doing exactly what Jesus was doing in effect, not starting a new religion, but going back to the actual kind of a prophetic tradition, a message of the prophets, the religion of creation, egalitarian, nonviolent, uh, not acquisitive, care for the earth, that sort of thing. And so it's really kind of an ongoing story, isn't it, of that kind of tension that exists today, and the future of the earth may depend very much on which prevails.
One of the differences I'd say, though, is that the Christian tradition has largely, at least the official Christian tradition, is largely hidden in the corner, the alternative voices. So they have to be dug up and rediscovered. The Beguines, for how many
Mhm.
people know about the Beguines, egalitarian women, in the 13th century. Whereas the Hebrew Bible raised up as equal both versions. So, no question, people have been fighting to have whatever version of the church they're a part of, Catholic or Protestant or whatever, conform more to the Gospels, just like there have been Americans who have seen this country would be better off if we treated the earth better and treated immigrants better, etc. Um, my point is simply that that's trying to go a direction that against it's not a return to what it once was. It's a dream of something it never has been.
Mhm.
And I share that dream, whether it's of the country or of the church. Wouldn't it be great if the church repented and embraced the gospel? A Catholic pastor in suburbia here in the Seattle area once told me, when I asked him that directly before I'd written these books, but we were standing out in the parking lot full of SUVs and things, and I said to him, "Why do you give people such, lighthearted nothing? I knew him well enough to speak to him honestly." And he said, "Wes, if I preach the gospel, they wouldn't change their lives. They just find a different church.
Mhm.
They just go to the church that preached the message they liked." And I think because of economics, that's the pressure that if you want to look at universities now, oh my God, Trump has the universities by their federal dollars, don't they? And so
Mhm.
they're suddenly terrified of speaking out. We'll lose our money and our research, and it's real. They'll have to fire people. People will lose their jobs. There's a price to be paid for speaking the truth to power, isn't there? But if you found that you're beholden to them economically, then that's how they silence you. And that's why Paul is an itinerant, awning maker or whatever leather worker he is, and why Jesus warns against being anxious about money. The anxiety about it, the worrying about it is what leads people, as we know, to think I can't take radical action because I would have, how will I pay the bills? I learned from Jim Douglas decades ago when I was in my 30s and Jim Douglas was already a revered elder. And I asked him, "How do you make a living, Jim, fighting against nuclear weapons?" Because he has no visible means of support that I could tell. And he'd been doing it for a while. And he said, he smiled beatifically as Jim Douglas could do and said, "If you do what God's wants you to do, the money you need will come." And I thought, oh, come on. But now 40 years later, it's worked for me. I'm not driving a brand new car, but I'm sitting here with you and I have enough food in my stomach, and that's all we really need, right? So I'm grateful for the time I've had to be able to be doing this without fear that some church is going to shut me down or an institution is going to fire me. The joy of retirement.
Well, thank you very much, Wes. I think it be obvious to anyone that these are not books you should necessarily read unless you're prepared to be challenged and maybe raise questions about how you live and what your faith is all about and what history is asking of you. You've been a real inspiration to me over many, many years, Wes. I'm very proud to have worked with you. And I urge everyone to read these books, and there are more where that came from, and to look at Wes's Radical Bible series on YouTube.
Can I make just a 30-second pitch for
Go ahead.
that
Yeah,
for a
sure.
second? The books that we've been talking about are overviews. They're a
Mhm.
big book in a sense, but small in another sense, given how comprehensive the Bible is. What I'm doing in Radical Bible is going word by word, verse by verse in the original languages,
Mhm.
so that people who can't afford or don't have the time for a seminary education or going to an academic library and getting very expensive books that present the original languages in their original language you can't read, can either start from the beginning with Genesis or Revelation or whatever I'm doing, or just look something up. I always wondered what the word was there or what that verse meant. So I hope it's a library to help people get up close. That one thing I've learned about reading the scriptures, like any relationship, you have to hang out together. The more
Mhm.
you spend time with your loved ones, the more you know them. So the more you spend time looking closely at the word, not just skimming it, the more the beauty of it will reveal itself. And I also just want to affirm how inspiring all of your incredible work with Dorothy Day, but also, making liberation theology a part of the tradition. So we can have our mutual admiration here, but there's nothing wrong with admiring good work done over the decades. So thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Wes. Please look up these books, Come Out My People and Empire Baptized. As I said, many other books by Wes as well as his videos. Thank you very much, my friend.
Yeah.